It's a huge honor, and I just want to thank the organizers and Plantagon for inviting me. Again, my name is Danielle Nierenberg, and I am the co-founder of a new and exciting organization called Food Tank, the Food Think Tank. Over the last couple of years, I've had a tremendous honor and opportunity to travel to more than 35 countries in sub-Saharan Africa, Asia, and Latin America, talking to farmers and farmers groups, scientists and researchers, policymakers and government leaders, and NGOs, journalists, and activists. And really just collecting their thoughts about what's working on the ground to help alleviate hunger and poverty while also protecting the environment. And while this work took me to primarily rural areas in developing countries, I've also been able to meet with urban farmers in cities as diverse as New York City, Milan, Ho Chi Minh, Ahmedabad, India, and many other cities across the world. Unfortunately, their work, growing food on rooftops, using gray water for fertilizer and irrigation, establishing urban farmer networks, selling food to restaurants and urban markets, and developing urban food businesses doesn't get the support and attention that it needs. In addition, I found that whether I'm at the World Food Prize, which is held in Des Moines, Iowa, or giving a presentation to a foundation in Europe, or talking to policymakers in sub-Saharan Africa, that there isn't much discussion about urban agriculture. And unfortunately, when it is discussed, it's often dismissed. And while I believe strongly that continued investment in rural agriculture is vitally needed, I also believe it's crucial that, and this is really something you all in this room know better than me, that we find ways to ensure that urban eaters and consumers, urban farmers, and urban food entrepreneurs get the support, attention, research, and investment they need as well to raise incomes, reduce malnutrition, decrease urban unemployment, and make cities more livable. So tonight, I want to highlight 3 reasons why it's important for the funding and donor communities, policymakers, and research institutes to invest in urban agriculture. And I'm really hoping to get advice from you all on other ways that we can convince them that cultivating the cities is necessary. The first reason, and the most obvious, and I think it's something you're all going to talk a lot over the next few days, is the numbers. Urban populations are growing rapidly, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, and we'll need to find ways to nourish those residents as well as provide them with economic opportunities. Many urban dwellers' access to food depends on the amount of money they have, and food purchases can absorb up to 80% of their incomes. Along with that, food prices can rise or skyrocket with almost no warning. And in many cases, urban agriculture and urban food businesses can really release people from this dependence on a volatile food market. By 2050, some 80% of the world's population will live in cities. And again, that's a really incredible statistic and shows how dramatically the Earth's landscape is changing. We now have more than 21 megacities in the world. 40 years ago, there were only 2. And by 2025, there will be an estimated 37 cities with more than 10 million people. This massive growth in urban population also places massive pressure on farmland in and around cities. Cities are literally eating up farmland. In California, between 2000 and 2002, the state lost more than 50,000 acres of farmland as a result of urban development. California, along with Texas and Florida, provide most of the fruits and vegetables that are grown domestically in the United States. And while most policymakers and agricultural activists in the US aren't saying much about this loss of land yet, there's an underlying fear that there will be questions about where our food comes from 20, 30, and 50 years from now. Worldwide, there are an estimated 800 million urban farmers producing 50 to 20% of the world's food. 200 million of these are farmers who produce food for markets and employ 150 million people. But as I will talk about a little bit later, those numbers are a little bit squishy or inaccurate. We're not sure how many farmers there are, and where urban farming is taking place. Africa, where hunger and poverty tend to be most acute, is urbanizing faster than the rest of the world, with 14 million people moving to cities each year. This is a migration that is second only to the massive rural to urban shift happening in China's cities. This shift is and will continue to strain urban infrastructure, including water and sanitation services, and medieval diseases like cholera are on the rise in many cities because we haven't figured out how to deal with those problems. It's estimated that by 2020, some 35 to 40 million Africans will depend almost entirely on food grown in cities to meet their daily food requirements. This farming of cities can be a source of nourishment and income, and there's no shortage of successful models of urban food production around the world. But what's needed is recognizing that the role these farms will play and modifying land and sewage regulations to prepare cities for the farms of the future. Cities that want to better feed themselves will be making massive investments in food infrastructure and food businesses, from food processing facilities to slaughterhouses, and from public markets to food distribution centers. However, the funding and incentive for these sorts of initiatives is lacking. African governments and funders and governments in general around the world tend to view urban agriculture as backward, and it's not something to be acknowledged, much less invested in. As I was preparing for this conference, I took a look again at the database of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and looked at all of their grantees who were receiving funding on agriculture. It's a really impressive list of some of the most innovative and interesting agriculture projects in the world. But there's really something missing. There's nothing concrete on urban agriculture. There are some wastewater initiatives that have potential to help urban farmers, and some projects that are focused on cooling centers for milk production to help urban consumers get access to milk and other dairy products. But there's nothing specifically on urban agriculture as far as I can tell. And that's a loss not only for the nearly 1 billion farmers who are participating in urban farming around the world, but it's also a loss for a foundation that is one of the biggest investors in agriculture in the world and known for being innovative. And that really leads to my second point, that maybe the reason that foundations and governments and others aren't investing in urban agriculture is because we lack concrete data on a lot of specifics around urban agriculture. Early last year, I had the opportunity to talk to a group of graduate students at Stanford University. And they are studying urban agriculture and are very interested in this lack of data. They had a lot of questions on, how many urban farmers are there actually in the world? That 800 million figure is from I think the late 1990s. And in which cities are they growing food? Because we're not doing a good job of mapping where these farmers are. And how many consumers actually depend on urban agriculture? And again, some of this data is there, but there's not a lot of new research being done to collect it and make sure it gets implemented. And while studies on urban agriculture do exist for several major cities around the world, much of the information we have is still qualitative or anecdotal. On the one hand, we believe there's a huge potential for urban agriculture to play a substantial role in poverty and food insecurity reduction. But many experts warn that this should not be overemphasized because urban agriculture's share in income and overall agricultural production can often be quite limited. In other words, urban farmers often don't have the ability to grow a lot of crops, and at the same time, they're not making a lot of money selling those crops. On the other hand, however, urban agriculture's role can't be too easily dismissed, particularly in much of Africa and other developing countries in the world. Researchers from the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization have found fairly consistent evidence of a positive correlation between engagement in urban agriculture and dietary inadequacy indicators. In other words, people involved in urban agriculture tend to eat better, which is absolutely no surprise because they have better access to food. Technology is also helping farmers and researchers figure out where urban farms actually are and their economic and health impacts. In Chicago, Illinois, where I live, urban agriculture experts and urban policymakers have had a hard time measuring how many farms there are in the city. So they've turned to Google Maps for assistance. After 400 hours over a period of 8 months, researchers located more than 4,600 sites with signs of food production. 86% of those were actual places of food production, and the majority of sites were backyard gardens and vacant lots, the type of gardens which aren't actually or usually included in most studies on urban agriculture. And urban entrepreneur Todd Jones has recently started a web initiative called Every Last Morsel. The idea behind it is fairly straightforward: to create an online hub where local gardeners can share information about what they're growing, where they're growing it, and what's for sale. This information can easily be shared with both customers and other gardens through a robust mapping application. And these sorts of initiatives are connecting producers and consumers and producers to one another are only going to become more important in both developing and industrialized countries alike. For example, the use of cell phones has increased fivefold in sub-Saharan Africa over the last decade. Nearly every farmer that I've met with, and even the most remote areas of Tanzania or Ghana or the Gambia, has access to a cell phone. And these farmers are using them not only to communicate with one another, but also to find out information about weather and markets. They're using them for banking and financial transactions, and they're using them to get information about how to grow their crops. The future of urban agriculture is likely to be much more knowledge intensive than it is today, making cell phones and the internet and other tools more important than ever for gathering information and enabling farmers, urban planners, and policymakers to make better decisions. The last reason I think we need to invest more in urban agriculture is the opportunity. There's such great potential for economic and entrepreneurial activities in cities and slums around the world around food production. As many of you know, Sweden has been at the forefront of urban agriculture and planning. Green Fortune was founded here in 2004. It started with rooftop gardens in Stockholm and has expanded to install rooftop and vertical gardens, as well as selling urban agricultural products to countries across Europe. Farming the City in Stockholm has brought together city dwellers to explore inspirational ways of producing, storing, cooking, and preserving, as well as distributing and sharing food in their city. They use existing city resources and neglected spaces, coupled with new technologies, to make cities more sustainable and to promote urban agriculture and sustainable energy use. And of course, there's Plantagon, the global leader in innovation around vertical farming and sustainable energy use in agriculture. This innovative spirit is also present in sub-Saharan Africa. And if you've ever traveled to a slum in Nairobi, Accra, or Kampala, you understand what I'm talking about. This entrepreneurial energy is there despite the fact that Africa has the world's largest slum population, with around 210 million people. And in sub-Saharan Africa, 200 million urban residents live on less than $2 per day. Half of Nairobi's slum children are chronically malnourished, and as you all know, the main cause of urban malnutrition is poverty. A healthy diet costs the average poor household almost all of their income. But farmers who grow their own food not only are able to eat part of what they grow, but they're also having a bigger opportunity to sell their produce to other consumers. I visited Kibera, which is believed to be the largest slum in sub-Saharan Africa, with anywhere from 700,000 to 1 million people. Several thousand of the women in Kibera have organized themselves into what they call self-help groups. And several of these self-help groups are finding innovative ways to grow food and raise livestock in their communities. One innovative thing they've done is to develop what they call vertical gardening. This is very different from the Plantagon version, but essentially it's using tall, empty rice or maize sacks, filling them with soil, and then growing food on different levels. The sacks come to about here on me, and the women poke holes all around the diameter and are able to grow food on top and as well as in those holes. These women are able to consume part of what they grow, and again, they sell the surplus to other people in their community. The interesting thing about these vertical gardens, though, is that they became an important source of food security in 2007 and 2008 when the elections were occurring in Kenya and a lot of riots and strikes occurred. So not a lot of food was coming into Kibera, but the women and families who depended on these vertical gardens weren't going hungry. And during this time, they were also able to sell part of their produce, so they were making money when not a lot of other economic opportunities were going on in that part of the city. Another group of farmers in Kibera is doing some innovative gardening on an empty lot that's adjacent to the slum. The farmers are not only growing food to eat and to sell, but also, perhaps surprisingly, they're becoming a source of inputs for rural farmers. These farmers are growing seeds for indigenous and traditional vegetables. A lot of them I can't pronounce, but one is spiderwiki. They're also growing things like okra, seeds for okra, tomato, eggplants, and other vegetables. And then they're selling those seeds to rural farmers. There aren't a lot of local seed companies in Eastern Africa, and both rural and urban farmers alike often have a hard time finding good quality sources of local seeds to grow. These seed beds have turned out to be very profitable as well. One of the farmers I met with in Kibera explained to me that the seed beds have not only helped her to be able to send her children to school, but she's also become a landowner for the first time, buying her own plot outside of Nairobi. This project really, for me, dispels the myth that urban agriculture can only feed the poor and hungry in cities. It can also be a crucial and important source of inputs for rural farmers as well. The other entrepreneurial endeavor I want to talk about tonight is occurring in Europe. And I recently attended the Barilla Center for Food and Nutrition annual conference in Italy. And the winner of the Barilla Center Young Earth Solutions Prize, this is a prize given to young scientists and researchers to come up with sustainable solutions for the future. This prize is called Manna from Rooftops, and it was developed by a woman named Frederica Mara, who is a young graduate student in Japan. And she has come up with a really innovative way for urban foodies or people interested in local food systems to access food as well as make a profit. Frederica wanted to do a couple of things with her project. One, she wanted to make cities in Europe more sustainable. And two, she wanted to involve young people in what she calls a new ecology around food. She developed this project to engage young people across Europe in an international network of activities, combining education, communication, and business. Participants will actively take part in food cultivation, preservation, cooking, and the sale of food products through roof gardens, window farms, and edible walls. And the facilities they will be working in will provide urban communities with fresh and local produce while taking care of their own energy supply, water, and waste needs. The participants in the project will learn how to prepare and preserve vegetables and other crops, take cooking classes, and attend talks by international food, nutrition, and sustainability experts. And then again, they will sell their surplus to shops, city markets, and via the internet. The project also helps to create a shorter loop between producers and consumers and support local food production and agricultural tourism in cities. And these sorts of examples that I've been describing aren't isolated. They're happening here in Sweden, obviously. They're happening all over Europe. They're happening in the United States on a pretty big scale. And they're obviously happening in developing countries all over the world. The final thing I want to talk about tonight is I really want us to remember that farmers aren't just farmers. They're businesswomen and businessmen and entrepreneurs. They're educators who share their knowledge with other people in their communities. And they're stewards of the land whose agricultural practices can protect soil and water and enhance biodiversity. For example, a study by the Conservation Law Foundation in the United States found that urban agriculture in the city of Boston not only has the potential to create jobs and improve access to fresh and healthy produce, but also sequester about 112 tons of CO2 in soils annually. And it can help divert 35% of Boston food waste from landfills, which will help avoid 43,000 tons of CO2 emissions each year. The misconception that urban agriculture will come at the expense of rural development is slowly being dispelled, but we have a long way to go in convincing policymakers and governments in Europe, North America, Asia, Latin America, and Sub-Saharan Africa to remove the barriers and improve laws and policies and health and safety measures that will make urban farming easier and more effective. In conclusion, I just want to highlight that urban agriculture is emerging as a solution to many of our global problems. Around the world, urban farming is being used to strengthen communities by providing a means of income and livelihood, nourishing families through improved crop production, and protecting the earth through ecological practices that are being done in cities worldwide. We're highlighting a lot of these innovations over the next year on our website, foodtank.org, and I'd love to interact with you all and for you to share with me the practices that are being done in your own cities and communities. So thank you very much.